So would you please welcome to the stage David Cuillier and Nancy Sharkey from the U of A School of Journalism. So we're going to discuss The Witness, and I just wanted to kind of kick things off with a question, I guess for Nancy to start with. So this movie is obviously a real personal perspective on the aftermath of a really, really kind of unthinkably horrible crime. But what the movie does is also open up larger sociological questions, obviously, and particularly for our purposes here tonight about journalistic ethics. And it doesn't go into a whole lot of detail about the New York Times piece of what happened, but I figured you could probably talk with some authority on that, Nancy.
Yeah, thank you. It's such a powerful piece. I had seen it once before. A quote that's been haunting me all week actually comes from our first movie, Journalism on Screen, last fall, Absence of Malice. The screaming, I'm sorry, I'm still shaky from the recreation. It was really powerful. This quote from Absence of Malice was the trailer, and I've been thinking about it all week as I've considered The Witness. Suppose you picked up the morning newspaper and your life was a front page headline, and everything they said was accurate, but none of it was true. Well, in this case, we had flaws, serious flaws in accuracy, and a fundamental untruth. Why? Why did this happen? We saw Bill Genovese go through the factual errors, and I think you saw Joseph DeMay, who is a real important figure in the correction of what happened to Kitty Genovese. Joseph DeMay, he's a retired maritime lawyer from Kew Gardens, who started a history blog about Kew Gardens just for fun, and he realized he had to deal with Kitty Genovese. He went through a lot of the transcripts himself, and he finally said, yeah, people heard something. You can question how a few people behaved, Joseph Fink, Carl Ross notably, but it wasn't 38 people watching a woman be slaughtered for 35 minutes and saying, oh, I don't want to be involved. So how and why did the New York Times get this story so wrong? I think we have to start with Abe Rosenthal. Abe had just become city editor after 11 years as a foreign correspondent. Abe covered the independence movement in India. He was the first American Jewish correspondent to report from Poland in the late 1950s. His story on Auschwitz, visiting Auschwitz in 1958, which ran in the magazine as an essay, is still one of the seminal pieces of early Holocaust reportage. And he then went to Japan, which is rebuilding from World War II. In all these places, countries, nations were struggling with who they are going to be, where they go in the 20th century. So he comes back thinking about public participation. And he becomes city editor of the New York Times at age 41, just as John Kennedy is assassinated. He's named city editor in November of 1963. He's struggling in New York to find a set of stories that show a larger urban perspective. In the same way, a foreign correspondent tries to define stories abroad that Nick Lemon, who used to be the dean at Columbia, uses the word resonant incident. One story that has a larger set of themes that show something about society. So he's city editor for 4 months, and the city is going through tremendous changes. CORE, Congress of Racial Equality, and the NAACP are becoming very active. There's a lot of social unrest, atomization of families, people moving to the suburbs. The sociologists are studying how television is making us all couch potatoes. I mean, there's all this stuff going on about how we revert to shells and cocoons in the city. So that's one thing he was thinking about, and he then decides, like a foreign correspondent, to do some reporting. And I think that there were three real problems here. One, that lunch with Police Commissioner Michael Murphy 10 days after she was killed. She's killed on March 13th. He goes to lunch with Murphy on March 23rd. 4 days later, 5 days later, the story appears. Full-formed, front page, New York Times. He never questions the police version. The police give him the 38. They give him a lot of information. Number two, who he assigns. He assigns someone who is not one of the stellar New York Times reporters. Gore Vidal is a reporter at the Times in 1964. Homer Biggert, one of the legendary New York City reporters, is working in the city room. He assigns a guy who's fundamentally a copy editor and sends him out to Queens, and they come back, prepare this story just 5 days later. I mean, if Day and Rye tried to get 38 witnesses in 5 days, we would be superhuman. It's crazy. It can take 38 days to get one good witness. And then finally, I think the flaw is, based on the lunch, based on what he hears, he imposes a narrative. We live our lives through stories. Journalists use a lot of narrative shorthand devices, myths, legends. This one becomes the parable of the bad Samaritans. But we see it all the time. We see it in our election coverage today, the horse race coverage. Is she ahead? Is he ahead? Who's stampeding ahead? Who's falling behind? We see the young unsung hero. We see Goldilocks stories. We see Cinderella stories, Hare and the Tortoise. You name it, with these myths that get imposed into stories. However, you're generally doing reporting before you come up with what is the real story behind the story. How can I make this intelligible to readers? And so I guess fundamentally what I come down to with the Kitty Genovese story, why did it live for so long when we've known for almost 2 decades about these flaws? What was it? Some of it, I suppose, is the struggle with the disruptive social change that was happening in the 60s. Some of it is, as I said, there was a great fear in the early 60s of a moral collapse of society. And I think that it comes in part from that. Were they trying to sell newspapers? Probably. But the Times didn't tend to sell newspapers by sensationalizing like this. That was more the Daily News, still the New York Post today. So I really think that Abe thought he was getting into a larger set of issues and had found the resonant incident. We've got a lot more information about various people. One of the sad things that I think about this story is the idea that her partner, Mary Ann, was the first person to go to the morgue and identify the body before Bill's uncle went. March 13th, 1964, was exactly 1 year to the day after Kitty picked up Mary Ann in a bar on McDougal Street, a gay and lesbian bar on McDougal Street. It would have been their first anniversary. And it's, when I was glad we at least heard her voice. I would love to have seen her. In terms of the 2 witnesses who could have made a difference, Joseph Fink, no one, not the prosecutor, not the cops, nobody can explain why Joseph Fink, the elevator operator, sees the first stabbing and does nothing. The second one is far more complicated. They didn't get into a lot of the story of Carl Ross. Top of the stairs, opens the door, closes the door. He is a very closeted gay man in a time when gay sex is illegal. The police are not your friend. He is an alcoholic. He's drunk that night. It's 3:30 in the morning. He actually called Mrs. Farrar and was the one who gave her the heads up, which is when she got the phone call, is why she went downstairs. He then calls another friend, crawls out the window, goes across the roof, goes into that friend's house, and they finally decide to call the police. There had been other calls to the police that, as you saw, people reported saying. There were about 5 other witnesses who said they called the police. But again, this is a problematic time in New York City. Number one, you had to call the precinct. 1964, so we're looking at QN51400, right? We're not looking at 911. That didn't, in fact, this case helped prompt the arrival of 911 in New York City and then through the rest of the country. So you either had to dial the operator or call the local precinct. Several people reported that the police basically said, yeah, mind your own business, or yeah, there was a bar fight at Bailey's across the street, we know about it, they closed the bar early, or we've already heard about it. So there was a lot of reporting that could and should have been done on the police response, I believe. And finally, I guess, one of the things that we need to think about, and I think that's changed enormously, back then, the Times was seen as setting the nation's news agenda. That, of course, is totally out the window. No one single news organization sets the agenda. And so the question is, could this kind of a flawed, untrue story happen today in today's digital media? And it's a question that I pose to you and to my fellow panelist, Dave. So Dave's is going to talk, I think, a little bit about how citizens can actually correct the record, as Bill Genovese did, I think, so brilliantly, and then we'll take some questions.
Well, I think to answer your question, Nancy, it's yes and no, right? I mean, look at stories that break today. They have to go immediately online, and they're often unvetted, and they're often wrong. I mean, we saw that in Tucson just, 6 years ago, when Gabby Giffords was shot, and the media reporting that she died. Well, it's bad information. It's moving, things are going fast, and things get out there faster than ever. So, so there's a lot of bad stuff getting out there to the public that had more time to be vetted by journalists in the past.
Well, and let me just jump in. Before you do that, I got to tell you a little story about the Gabby Giffords thing, because I was on deck for the Times, and we had one of our professors from the university, Lisa Button, was in the emergency room, called me, said, NPR and the website of the Times is reporting she's dead, and I'm here, and I know she's not. And so I called the national desk, and journalists corrected, these rumors.
Right. But on the flip side, once information gets out there, it's a lot harder to cover it up, bad information. And Dan Rather found that out the hard way when they had records about Bush's fake records, and bloggers looked into it, exposed it. So it is harder to keep a bad story down today, I think. And in this movie, I think what's really interesting is, this movie's a lot like Rashomon, a Japanese movie where people see things from different perspectives. And the person who probably exhibited the best acts of journalism was Billy Genovese here. He was really being a journalist at heart. He questioned, I think he even said, I was a curious boy, I was always asking questions. That's what journalism is all about. And when you look at all the perspectives he looked at throughout the movie, Mosley's son, Mosley, the prosecutor, Rosenthal, the neighbors, all these folks, they all had different perspectives. And he all tried to piece it together to get at the truth. And he acknowledged he may never get at the truth. And I think that's the case journalists find themselves in today. They're just trying to do their best. Sometimes they mess up. And I think that, we all acknowledge the Times messed up this time. And they no doubt other times, Nancy kind of is very modest, but she worked for the Times for 25 plus years, knew Rosenthal, helped get rid of Jason Blair. There's a lot of things that go on behind the scenes.
Yeah, and even in the Jason Blair case, the Times, he fabricated and plagiarized 34 stories over a 6-month period, and we re-reported all of them to find out where the errors were, where the mistakes, where the plagiarism, and we asked people, if you knew it was wrong, why didn't you call? And it's like Gabe Pressman, it's like the other journalists there, it was in the New York Times, so they didn't call. So it's one of the reasons the Times has created the public editor, but also opening to comments, checking other sites. And still, stuff gets wrong. I mean, what is it Churchill said, rumor runs around the world while truth is still getting up and putting on its pants. And I feel like that with the Genovese story. I feel like that with so many stories in the press. First draft of history, very flawed. On Winston Moseley, I should tell you that he died just 5 months ago. He was in Dannemora prison in Clinton County, New York, up by the Adirondacks, the place where those two guys tunneled out a couple, I think 2 summers ago. Was it a year and a half ago? So he was 81 years old, and this letter to Genovese was among probably the last things he wrote. But he was what the prosecutor who is featured in this is the first guy Genovese meets in Kew Gardens to go around and see. He characterized Moseley as a sociopath and necrophiliac. His desire was to rape women as they were dying. That was his gratification. So he has been dead 5 months, died at 81, one of the longest serving prisoners in New York State, served almost 51 years. Should we take some questions?
I just have a question for the two of you, if I could just pose this. To me, one of the, and I heard kind of gasps from the audience when the scene happened, when Bill Genovese is talking to Mike Wallace, and Mike Wallace says, "Oh, I believed it because the New York Times said it." So do you feel that today there's still that kind of trust in traditional media that there was back then, or has that eroded to the point that that's not really a valid statement any longer?
Well, I wasn't working back then, so I don't know for sure. But I think
Nor was I.
Neither of us. But I think that still exists today, is my sense. Maybe not to the extent it did back then. But I think if something runs in the New York Times, it's taken very seriously. Probably less so at the metropolitan level. I mean, I'm not sure a lot of newspapers have the same clout they used to, or TV stations, TV shows. I don't know, what do you think, Nancy?
Yeah, if you read the original Martin Gansberg story in the Times, one of the things that stands out is the lack of attribution and transparency. And I think that in our digital age, the good journalists have really tried to explain to the reader how they got the information, where they got the information, who said it, how it was verified, and I think that's made some difference. I think the Times, just because it's a newsroom of 1,200 people, there is a vetting process. We went through a lot of soul searching. I think it tends to have some agenda setting role in terms of news today, but there are also great publications and television shows and documentary films that help move the nation's agenda forward in far more tangible and structural ways. So it's not the same thing as 1964. Of course, 1964, I mean, I don't know how many of you lived in New York in the 60s or 70s, but there was a huge number of papers. I mean, they were all over the place. When I saw Dick Wald, who moved into television later, was at the Herald Tribune, brilliant writers newspaper, just great coverage. The Washington Post is doing amazing stories under Marty Barron today. I think that the Post has become a real must-read. I think the big difference from then and now is, number one, audiences are more media literate. We're all producers as well as consumers of information and news. And number two, the professional media has felt a real need for integrity to show transparency, to show where the information came from. So those are two things that I've observed.
Does anyone have any questions?
I have one question about the film. I thought it was really well done, and I thought Bill Genovese was such a professional in how he went about this. And my question was, what was his profession? Was he a journalist or something like that, or what did he do for his life?
Well, I think after he got out of the service, I think he was on full disability. So I actually don't know the answer to that, if he got training as a lawyer. But he had evidence of both kind of a lawyerly approach, and also evidence to me of therapy. When he would ask people, what would it take for you to feel whole? Didn't you get that? I thought that was really interesting. He was, to me, he felt like a really fully evolved person.
And he was an excellent journalist. I mean, he tracked people down using records, which is really important. Harder today, by the way, now that more and more records are being closed and secretive. And this is one of the benefits of having open records. And then he interviewed people so well, and he questioned so well, and he kind of reminded me of Jon Stewart a little bit. I don't know if anybody else thought he looked like that without the humor. But I just thought it was a great case study in doing good journalism.
That's a great question, though. It's one thing I didn't research, and I should have. So I will, when I get home tonight, I'm going to find out what he did for a living. It's a great question.
And his recreation at the end of the film, I think really speaks to that.
I'm finally coming down from that.
Yeah.
It was really
He must have had
powerful.
experience as a therapist or with therapy or something.
Yeah.
Because that felt very
It did, didn't it?
therapeutic in a way
Yeah.
that I would have thought of doing, for
Yeah.
sure. How about here, please? Yes.
I saw a parallel between the film, which was about people ignoring the suffering of this woman, which I think they were. I think maybe some people claim they called the police, but basically, fundamentally, this woman was killed and nobody came to her
Yes,
assistance.
she could have been saved.
So I also see a parallel with the media, which a lot of people understood that this was not correct in the media, but they ignored it, they didn't speak up, they allowed this family to suffer all those years thinking the child was murdered like that. I wondered if...
That's a great comment, and I think Bill drew that out brilliantly in this. And I had not thought of the parallel between the bystander effect in Kew Gardens, bystander effect in the media. So that's a really great observation. I totally agree.
And I think it's even worse today since newsrooms are cut in half and reporters are stretched so thin, they're just not going to take the time to question other journalists reporting. I mean, they have their own stuff they're dealing with, and so, if anything, it's probably just going to get worse, I think, in a lot of ways.
Yeah, we rely more on people like, Joseph DeMay, lawyer from Kew Gardens, who started re-reporting it. So that's how it happened.
How about him in the red shirt, please?
I have two comments. One, going back to film, I'm just struck by the man who shot Liberty Balance, and the statement is that when the legend comes back, print the legend. This film just really overwhelmed me. The other thing is it's a real story, and it doesn't talk about the social background, but this happened to me. This was when I was stationed at Bagram Air Base, and I was watching CNN, and I was watching Barbara Starr talking about how we were attacked by 3 Haqqani soldiers, or suicide, or whatever you want to call them, and she said, my sources are absolutely spot on. And it was total nonsense because they never even came close to penetrating the actual chain link fence. It took half an hour for us to just cut the fence open to retrieve the bodies after we shot them. Wow. The other thing about that was that she was in Germany. She had absolutely no clue as to what was going on, but she was reporting this. We saw this report twice until we moved on to whatever the next story was for the 24-hour cable news is.
Yes, please.
I just want to say, I'm from Kew Gardens. I was there.
You were there in 1964?
6 blocks away from where I lived.
Oh my God! And
Elementary school was 2 blocks away. So it was,
And?
really good to see this. It didn't make sense at the time. I know where the Long Island Railroad is. I'm wondering if they talked about the noise from the Long Island Railroad.
I don't think that it happened between, she had gotten off her shift as the manager of Eve's 11th Hour, and the attack happened between roughly 3 and 3:35 in the morning, and that's mostly commuter. right?
Right.
So there weren't, yeah, I don't think they started until 5, or that was covered somewhere. I've read it somewhere that the trains were not at that time running. And I felt it was a little misleading when they had the train with the screen, right? I thought, no way, the trains weren't running when, you know. Now there is a school of thought, and I don't know this, that we'll ever know the answer to this, that she was stabbed in her right lung with the hunting knife 2 or 3 times, and one of the medical examiners felt that she could not have vocalized as loudly in the vestibule, that Ross heard her, but it's entirely possible no one else heard those screams if they were
Well, the
there.
vestibule, there was no way anybody could hear.
No, it's behind the building, because the storefront's in front, yeah. Yeah, you're from Queens, and I immediately start going to New York. So, sorry.
Well, this makes me feel so much
Oh,
better.
Here, sir, please.
Yeah, I just want to get your thoughts. I'm going to riff for a second about the difference between the influence on journalism of either facts or cultural myth.
Mm-hmm.
You started to talk about that a little bit. He was looking for that connecting story.
Mm-hmm.
I first heard about this case from an award-winning short story called The Whimper of Whipped Dogs by Harlan Ellison. And that story won an award from Mystery Writers of America and really kind of hit me mythologically. It was about the nature of evil and these bystanders. And he had taken the story too from what had become the popular sort of take on it. And then I think about how culturally these stories get driven. So for example, on that nature of evil, that period in which we had all the reporting about the satanic cults in America that were extremely exaggerated, and the police were all looking at these cases based on a lot of false information. But the zeitgeist, the culture, was sort of preoccupied with this drive. And in a sense, at the time, the focus was not on her. The myth of the time was what was going on collectively.
Right.
And it seems like one of the powerful things about the film as a work of journalism is the shift back to the individual.
Right.
It felt like such a powerful reorientation of the myth back onto focusing on the reality of who this person was.
Yeah.
So in all of that, how do you feel as people working with the profession of journalism that journalism finds a way to navigate, and do they do it really consciously, between the fact that they're going to be driven both by facts and by whatever the zeitgeist or the culture is desiring in that moment?
And I don't think we spend enough on the latter that you mentioned. It's definitely there, and we move with the times, and I don't think we spend enough time examining what are the cultural stereotypes, what's the zeitgeist, and what are we all following. On the point about cultural myths, about the use of myth and fable and parable in journalism, it's very, very common to see someone report a story and then decide, okay, what I've got is a David and Goliath story. And you see it in film all the time. City Mouse, Country Mouse, right? Devil Wears Prada, right? Emperor Has No Clothes. That's another really great myth, right? Anybody see The Interview with Seth Rogen about North Korea, right? Emperor Has No Clothes, right? So we use some of these stories that we've grown up with, and they become a narrative shorthand for audience. And I think that we can, as you suggest, examine how we deploy them and under what circumstances. The problem here is the narrative was defined before any reporting was done. This is going to be a parable of the 38 bad Samaritans. And that was imposed. There was not enough reporting time, and there wasn't enough attention to the facts of what actually happened. I mean, as you mentioned from Bagram, you've got this speculation that is presented as fact that's very damaging to you, to the military, to American audiences about what's going on. But we're also, as journalists, often looking for, I mean, you know, you can write, and there have been tons of books written about Kitty Genovese. We're looking at 12,000 or 1,200 words, right? Or how do we capture it in an image? And we see this all the time. You've seen the boy in Aleppo, Amran Makrouche, 5 years old, sitting alone on the orange ambulance chair with the blood on his eye, right? He's become like the resonant image for all children in Syria suffering from the bombings by Assad.
Has he become the image of that, which is what we act like he's become, or has he actually just become the image of the way we actually are comfortable?
Well, I think
framing?
both things are true. I think both things are true, and I think that's a great observation. Yeah, yeah. Thank you for your comment.
So we have time for a couple more questions. I know, sir, you had your hand up.
You were talking earlier about how the New York Times used to be considered the source for information, news source, reliable. And I wonder if with the modern proliferation of news sources, both in cable channels and on the internet, and people they found to go to the sources that agree with their pre-existing outlook on the world. There's actually less questioning now of news sources than there used to be because they only go to one.
Yeah, so the question, great question. The Times used to be seen as the agenda-setting source for news. Now, with the fragmentation of media, with so many different media channels, people do tend to have a polarized consumption of media, so that if you're right-leaning, you're going to go to the right stations and channels and websites, and left-leaning. And so the synthesis for many people is not there. And we worry about that a lot.
Oh yeah, the echo chamber is causing greater political polarization. The research is pretty strong on that. It's causing all sorts of issues, I think, in our society, and including what you say, less questioning of other media because people don't absorb any other media other than what reinforces their existing views. You're absolutely right.
Well, and it got to the point, a couple of questions in the back, but let me make one more observation. It got to the point where Karl Rove, during the Bush administration, famously told the New York Times Magazine that, well, that the facts become reality, and that those of you who live in the reality-based world are never going to understand what we have done here in this revolution of information.
All right, yeah, right down the back, there's two, so we'll take these two more questions on the end, and then we'll move over. Yeah.
I'm wondering about the police department and their part in all this, because it seems like all the different avenues want to blame the 38 witnesses. But what happened, I mean, I think Bill had said, well, it should take only 2 minutes for the police to get there. Well, this was over 35 minutes supposedly. When did they actually get there? We never heard that.
Yeah, they finally got there after Ross, having climbed through the window out to his friend's house, drunk on vodka, calls the police, and they get there 2 minutes, you know, as she's dying, with Mrs. Farrar holding her. But it's a great question because one thing about this that I don't think has been explored enough is the minimization of domestic violence. A lot of people thought it was a couple who were fighting. And domestic violence in the early 60s, as we know, was often minimized. So callers were told, mind your own business, it's a domestic squabble, we're not going to do anything. And it almost had to rise to felonious assault or murder before the cops would do anything. And I think that, you know, we are so, it's changed so much. But I do think that the police bear some culpability, and if we were reporting it today, that would have been a huge question to ask.
Well, I think that's an important thing to bring up in just the story that I think was glossed over a little bit, in that the prosecutor and the police seem to have this frame
Right.
that the New York Times picked up. Bill Genovese was going on testimony that was in trial
Right.
long after the New York Times had done a story. So, you know, is it fair to completely slam the Times for not getting it right from the get-go days after the murder.
Yeah, I just did.
When the police or the prosecutor were pushing that frame, and that is a problem with the media. They rely too much on official sources, particularly out of the gate, and they're relying more and more on public information officers that sometimes aren't completely providing everything that should be divulged. So the whole reporting mechanism is a part of this, and it's probably worse today because of that.
What about the last question there, the waving? Yes, yes.
I just had two comments. One of them was, in light of that insane letter that Bill Moseley wrote, why did the two people who Bill went to see if he could speak with him, as well as the son, not let on, you know, he's not right in his head. You're not going to get much information anyway, unless it was just a manipulative letter that he decided to make up because they said he had a high IQ and he had gotten a college degree. I'm surprised that the court people or the people that were sitting with him didn't say, man, he's not gonna make any sense. That was one.
Yeah, they were really, really cautious. They were parole people, and they were really cautious because of legal restrictions on what they can say. The son that was a really interesting interview with the son.
Yeah.
And now the other thing, Bill's purpose in hiring that actress to do the screaming. I was wondering, because it came 50 years later, I wish I had noticed the windows were all dark. Was he doing that to see how many lights would go on? Because 50 years later, people would probably be more reticent about minding their own business.
Yeah, I don't know. What do you think, Jeff? What was your observation of that?
Well, because of the therapy angle, I felt like he just needed to actually witness it.
Yeah,
because it was
that's
so
kind of
much.
what I felt.
And the title of the film is The Witness, so I sort of took that to be that Bill wanted to witness the event.
And remember, he had posted warnings, warning the neighborhood that there was going to be something happening. So they may have thought, they're shooting another darn movie in my neighborhood. The streets are blocked off and I can't stand it. We lived in Brooklyn Heights for a while and it was always happening.
And I think that's a good question of the director. What role did the director have in that? Was that something to help the documentary? I mean, all those are valid questions to find out, you know, kind of what went into the
He did
thinking
provide
of
a
that.
climax. I
I don't know. I think that's a good question of how they put it together and why.
Yeah, well, it's a very powerful film. This is my favorite kind of documentary because it's personal, but it opens up so many amazing, interesting issues. So I really want to thank Nancy and David for being here and talking us through it.
Thank you. Great questions and
Thank you
comments.
all.
And come out to Spotlight with Rich Gilman, a U of A alum and Tucson native.
Yes, September
and the other
25th.
movie series.
Yes.
What is that? When is it?
September 25th, Sunday afternoon, 2 p.m. And then Rich will be here, interviewed probably by our friend Bill Schmidt, who worked for the Times for a while. Thank you so much for your attention,
Thank you.
for your passion, for your great questions.